one of the reasons we wanted to be involved with Land for What is recognising that we work with people who are managing parks, who are running woodlands, who are growing food, and actually parks and public space is often something that's not seen in a kind of land context, whereas we think it's a really potentially important issue. So we're a think and do tank, a social enterprise, so we're not for private profit, and we exist in a slightly cheesy way to make land work for everyone is our tagline. What we see that as, so like I said, we work across all different types of land use, and about half of what we do at the moment is what we call supporting practice. So we work with landowners and social enterprises and community organisations who are engaging with land. A really big chunk of that over the past couple of years has been about parks and public spaces. So we thought, just to kick off, I'd give you a bit of an overview of what we're seeing is happening, and then talk about some of the things we see as issues. Dave's then going to respond to that from the kind of community sector friends group point of view, and then we'll put you back into groups to have some big discussions. So a bit of context. Like Dave mentioned earlier, parks are not a statutory service. So if you are a local authority, you do not actually have to provide parks. There's lots of people who think you should have to, by law, provide parks, and there's campaigning about that going on. And we tend to think that would probably be a good idea, that local authorities should have to do that. But currently, if you're a local authority, you have to pick up the rubbish, you have to pick up the recycling, you have to make sure there's money for adult social care, you have to make sure there's money for children's social care, and everything else kind of falls under the discretionary budget. And so, as you all probably know, we have been living under austerity in public budgets for the past few years, and local authorities have been quite badly hit by budget cuts. And because parks and green spaces are not statutory services, they have been particularly badly hit. So we are seeing commonly cuts to local authority parks budgets of between 30 and 50%, in some cases up to 90%. So parks managers are being told, okay, you have to work out how to provide parks in this area on 10% of the money that you used to have. So this is a crisis. Like, undoubtedly, there is a crisis in the funding of public space in this country. And also, as Dave said earlier, the kind of problematic thing about parks is you can often spend not very much money on them for a couple of years and people don't really notice. The friends group will notice because they'll know that there used to be some shrubs there that aren't there anymore. But in general, the decline is quite slow, but it's also, that means it's quite, you can't then just like suddenly put loads of money into a space and expect it to bloom up again. The decline is quite slow, the building back up is also quite slow. And I think one thing that's really important in this is local authorities are in a really difficult position here. They all recognise how important parks are to, even from a very mercenary point of view, nice parks mean higher house prices, mean more affluent people, mean more council tax. You know, even if they were all there as mercenary, bottom line focused people, they would still want to see nice parks in their area. But for most local authorities, they see the value, and they really appreciate the value of parks from a well-being point of view, from a point of view of bringing people together as in terms of community cohesion and community involvement, in terms of the health benefits that they provide for people, and also in terms of the environmental benefits around flood risk management. You've got to have green spaces to absorb the rain, around like cooling in urban areas. You need to have those trees. So what we're seeing is local authorities in a really hard position of their backs being very much against the wall in terms of funding, and really not wanting to cut these services because they see how important they are. And that's a horrible, I think, just to take a moment here, for those people managing those services, a horrible position to be in. But so what are they doing? So what we're seeing is kind of four main responses to this. And it does tend to vary depending on whether, and you're broadly a Tory-led, more right-wing council, or broadly a Labour-led, more left-wing council. We are seeing that the more conservative-led right-wing councils are seeing this as a sort of done deal. They're like, okay, this is the future. How do we respond to that? And are often being a bit more innovative and forward-thinking in terms of thinking, okay, we need to completely change the way we do this because this situation won't last. This situation is not going to stop. We're not going to have any more money for these, so we need to create a new solution. Broadly, and again, this is sort of a very broad split, the Labour-led councils tend to be more like, okay, this is more of a temporary thing. If we can get over this blip, maybe things will get back to normal and the budgets will go back up again. And so maybe less ambitious or innovative in terms of thinking about different types of models. So that's just a bit of context. But we are tending to see four main approaches to this kind of incredibly difficult situation. The first one is internal reorganisation. So them going, okay, often we're seeing, and interestingly I think, historically over the past 10 years or so, many councils have contracted out their grounds maintenance services to Veolia or any Capita or some of the big contractors, Serco, that type of thing. We're seeing people are starting to bring those services back in-house to say, actually, we would rather employ our own staff and our own grounds maintenance people to run our own parks. We're going to have a parks department again. We're going to bring that all back in and we're going to try and do it on less money. So we're going to, so yeah, they're going to do that. Some local authorities are going, okay, we need to sell some parks. Bexley, I think, sold 3 parks last year. They're going, okay, let's realise some capital value and then use that to put back into the rest of the park service. So almost all of them are thinking about which are the priorities in our parks portfolio, which are the things that are really important and which are the things that we might be able to lose. But so they're looking at transferring the ownership of, so you've got internal reorganisation, you've got people looking at transferring the ownership of their parks to another body. Often that is a charitable trust of some kind. Local authorities tend to, or many of them have, leisure trusts or people who are already running some of their libraries and their leisure centres, and they're starting to look at transferring the ownership of the parks into that body. Another thing we're seeing is authorities creating their own new management organisations, either for one park or a number of parks. So we've been working with Derbyshire County Council, for example, to set up a new trust, a new social enterprise, to manage Elveston Country Park and Castle, which is 200 hectares of open space on the edge of Derby. They go, we're never going to be able to make this work, so let's set up a new locally controlled trust that can raise money from different bodies, that can be a bit more entrepreneurial than the council, to look after this space for the very long term. So they're looking at a 150-year lease kind of thing. And then the other thing we're seeing a lot of is the potential for community partnerships. So local authorities turning to their local communities, whether that's friends groups or other types of organisations, and going, do you want to do a bit of volunteering? Do you want to take on a bit of responsibility for this? Can we maybe have a partnership together? So seeing where the authority's going, okay, all we can afford to do is cut the grass every couple of weeks and empty the bins. If you want anything else to happen in this space, it's up to you to do it. And there's huge opportunity there, I think, but also lots of risks, and you're asking people often in a very voluntary capacity to step up and take quite a lot of responsibility for what are really important spaces. So we're seeing those 4 main models, and across all of those, under each one of those models, people are having to think about, how do we cut costs? So how do we do the same or more with less money? So how do we save money on equipment? How do we save money on staffing? How do we save money on planting? So you're seeing across the country, you've probably all seen in a park a nice meadow that's sprung up of wild flowers. That's basically a cost-cutting measure, and it's a really nice cost-cutting measure. And I think mostly people look at those and go, "It's nice." And that's the kind of thing where there are opportunities to go, that's much better for the environment, it's much better for biodiversity, it's a really nice amenity for people to have, and bonus, it means you don't have to cut the grass with a petrol, sit on mower twice a week for the whole summer. So say Burnley Council have been doing a lot of really interesting stuff using permaculture principles to really change the management of some of their parks. So moving away from some of that very traditional Victorian style open space with planted borders and brightly coloured plants and manicured lawns into something that is a bit more naturalistic, a bit wilder. And again, that can cause massive debate locally of people feeling it looks untidy, not liking it, but there can be huge benefits from that as well. So we're seeing people cutting costs in all sorts of different ways. The other thing we're seeing is people looking to generate income in lots of different ways. And this is one of the things that, again, can be really contentious. You probably all heard about Bristol Council trying to charge the park run for running through the park and that. But, you know, from on the one hand, lots and lots of people jogging on wet grass every week messes the grass up. And we are in the territory of people going, well, we don't know how we're going to pay to keep the turf nice. But so whether it's charging for events, whether it's holding more winter wonderland style things, more fun fairs, more festivals, whether it's making sure that the cafes in the park are earning as much money as they possibly can and therefore paying as much rent as they possibly can, or whether it's increasingly charging personal trainers and like British military fitness type people for using the parks. And so there's a huge debate about how acceptable some of these things are. Battersea Park, so Wandsworth Council recently put that Go Ape into the park, which had a huge furore because it cost 25 quid to get in. But they're also saying, actually, this earns us this amount of money every year, which we can reinvest back in the park. It's probably less controversial than the it wasn't Formula 1, it was like Formula 4 or something, racing track that they put in for a while. So Wandsworth is one of those people who's been thinking a lot about different income generating models. So that's like a whistle stop of the kind of landscape that we're seeing. This is a time of huge change in the provision of public and open spaces. And it's one where all of the relationships are shifting, I think. And so we have a real internal debate, I suppose, within shared assets of like, we think there are opportunities here for communities and for sort of common good focused businesses, whether that's people who are food growing, people who are thinking about education, people who are interested in how people interact with the natural world, to actually make some parks much more than they have been in the past, to see parks as platforms on which lots and lots of different activities happen. But there are undoubtedly huge risks that you kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater and end up with a very, very minimal service with very little community involvement. And that equally, the risk it feels to me, to friends groups, that so much pressure is put on groups to take on management responsibilities for spaces that it ends up making the groups fall apart or challenging the sustainability of those groups in terms of particularly when you've got a lot of interested volunteers trying really hard to make things work. There are some undoubtedly great examples of friends group led management of parks, but what it seems to me is marking a shift in the relationship between like the citizen and the state at the local level. We are no longer just paying our council tax and the council is delivering the services for us. All of that is shifting. So what I would really like us to be able to do today is get Dave to respond to that very briefly, and then have a bit of either group discussions or a big discussion, depending on how people feel, but just about given that context, what should the future of public space look like in this country? Given that all of those changes are happening at the moment, should we be campaigning to get back to where we have been? Or should we be trying to create something new? And what might that look like? So, massive questions. But any questions on that before I just hand over to Dave? No, stunned. Great.
Stunned. I'm stunned, actually, yeah. I'll just say, I won't say much, but because for those that have turned up since the last session, we had a long discussion about the Friends Groups movement and community empowerment collective kind of taking ownership, moral ownership of our local public spaces and getting involved, all of which was very inspiring, hopefully. and Kate's now raised kind of more, if you like, strategic long-term funding and management issues for public green space in particular. I'm chair of the National Federation of Parks and Green Spaces, which is the voice of the local friends groups movement. There's 6,000 local friends groups across the UK, and there's many networks in local boroughs and local towns and counties around the country of friends groups. So we're a very significant grassroots movement, and we're having to grapple with a lot of the issues that Kate has just raised, really important issues. Our general view as the National Federation is that parks should be a statutory service, should be properly funded from taxation, and we wouldn't be having the crisis that we currently have. There's 27,000 urban public green spaces that we're concerned about the future of. And in terms of getting involved with the management, I think that that local councils have been working in partnership with friends groups. Friends groups have been taking more and more kind of involvement in decision making, taking on sometimes bits of parks and green spaces. In my park, we actually run the building in the centre of the park. We also manage the lake area and the woodland, but we do this in partnership with the council in the context of a 10-year funded management programme agreed with the lottery, because we had lottery funding. So I think there's not a conflict between people getting more involved in their green spaces. It's not a bad thing, it's a good thing. What is the bad thing? It is the lack of funding and the abandoning of their responsibilities by local authorities because of that. And that's what we're fighting against. So I think there's a lot of issues about getting involved with management that, in terms of all the people in this room, we should get involved in our green spaces and in our community groups that care about our green spaces and that use them. Getting involved in taking on management and maintenance functions is highly controversial when there's not enough funding. And whatever kind of structure you set up, funding is always going to be the issue. Long-term funding, guaranteed funding for the next 100 years. And that can only come about by making parks a statutory service and having adequate taxation-based funding. So, Kate, if you just explain now what you'd like people to do in the remaining...
So it feels like this is the big debate.
Yeah.
Of where should we be putting our energy right now, given that context? So at Shared Assets, we find ourselves, we're working on a number of projects with local authorities who are going, we need an alternative delivery model, what might that look like? And we're kind of trying to engage in those debates, and we are often engaging in those debates and those, delivering that work as consultants to local authorities, being like, are we just destroying things here? Are we somehow aiding and abetting the destruction of the state? Because that's not something we want to do. And I think this is the big question. Should we be putting our energies into campaigning for parks to be funded as a statutory service and trying to get adequate funding into those under the kind of current model of local authorities running parks? Or should we be accepting that things are changing and trying to come up with new models that protect the common good and find money from elsewhere? And I think that's a genuinely live question at the moment. And I'd really love to hear your thoughts on it, because we don't know the answer. We're kind of active in both, we've got a foot in both camps, and that brings up some tensions. So I thought it's, we've got about 25 minutes before lunch. So what would be really good, unless anyone's got any sort of comments or burning questions right now, is to sit in your groups, maybe just even for 10 minutes or so, just to talk about that. Like, what are the pros and cons? What should the future management, funding, decision-making structures around parks and green spaces and public space look like? And then maybe we'll come back together for a bit of a debate and see if we can solve it before lunch. That would be great. Yeah? Does that make sense? Good.
areas are likely to be most under threat. That's totally unacceptable. And whether you go down the road of trying to campaign to make this a statutory duty of local government, that's a tricky question. I personally, I think I'm in favour of doing that, because I can see an alternative is going to be very, very difficult to achieve, and it's getting increasingly difficult to recruit volunteers for anything these days, because I think partly because people are so busy trying to make ends meet to afford housing, rather than anything else.
At the moment, there are of course groups interested in managing parks, the Friends for example, but we have lots of people that are disengaged. So we don't want that this approach becomes a way of enclosing common resources. So how do we actually give ownership, sense of ownership to community in the way that these parks become resources? So this is one issue, and the second issue is now how do we consider other functions that historically have been considered not considered being part of parks, like food. And so if food growing becomes an activity that is happening more broadly in public space and in parks, then we have to reflect on this way of engaging and managing parks in a way that various activities and various interests interrelate.
Whereas if it's a local authority, it's supposed to be open and democratic, and everybody contributes to it and everybody gets out of it. So I think those two things are in tension, and
needs to reclaim space in Britain as a colonial nation, what it means to be all entitled to the land, who is entitled to the land, and doing that this local work is important, but it needs to be done in the context. I think if we more consistently ask those questions and work on those questions, then in the red herring whether it needs to be an authority or not.
I think there's also that to talk about other people who are contributing. So whether businesses or other organisations should be putting money into things like parks, I think is a really interesting question, because coming back to who benefits from having really good public spaces.